Absolutely, here is the complete cinematic story in one continuous narrative, with the emotional pacing, suspense, hidden identity, sacrifice, and satisfying ending you requested. The fighter jet was falling out of the sky, smoke pouring from its wings, its pilot barely conscious behind the cracked glass canopy. When the command center realized the terrifying truth, every other pilot capable of reaching the enemy aircraft had already been forced out of the battle. There was only one fighter left on the runway, and the person sitting inside it was the quiet mechanic everyone had ignored for 8 years. Her name was Marin Vale, and for 8 years she had hidden the fact that she was not a mechanic at all, but one of the most gifted fighter pilots her country had ever trained. If you believe that courage can come from the most unexpected person, and that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our community can continue sharing stories that remind us what the human heart is capable of. Marin had learned long ago that sometimes surviving meant becoming invisible. At 32, she had mastered the art of walking through a military airbase without attracting attention. She wore grease-stained coveralls, kept her brown hair tied tightly behind her head, carried a battered toolbox everywhere she went, and spoke only when necessary. To most people at Falcon Ridge Air Station, she was simply Marin Vale, a maintenance technician who could diagnose an engine problem by sound and repair a damaged hydraulic line faster than almost anyone on the base. Nobody knew that before the coveralls, before the toolbox, before the carefully lowered eyes and quiet footsteps, Marin had been Lieutenant Marin Vale, an elite fighter pilot who had once been selected for a highly classified aviation program. Nobody knew why she had disappeared from the cockpit, and nobody knew why she had never tried to reclaim the life she had lost. 8 years earlier, Marin had been considered extraordinary. She had graduated near the top of her flight class, not because she was fearless, but because she understood fear better than most people. She respected it. She knew fear could save a pilot's life when it sharpened instincts instead of controlling them. Her instructors had praised her ability to remain calm under impossible pressure, and her commanding officer, Colonel Everett Shaw, had once written in her evaluation that Marin possessed the rare ability to think clearly when everyone else was thinking emotionally. She had dreamed of becoming a test pilot, but her dream had been tied to someone else's life as well. Her younger brother, Callum, had looked up to her since childhood. He had watched every graduation ceremony, every award presentation, every photograph of her beside an aircraft, and he had believed his sister could do anything. Then came the flight that destroyed everything. During a classified training exercise, Marin's aircraft suffered a catastrophic systems failure at high altitude. She fought the controls while warning alarms screamed around her. Another aircraft was flying dangerously close, and instead of ejecting immediately, Marin stayed with her damaged fighter long enough to steer it away from the other pilot. She survived the crash, but Callum, who had been part of the recovery unit assigned to the training operation, was killed when debris struck the rescue vehicle. The investigation eventually concluded that the mechanical failure had been caused by an overlooked manufacturing defect, but Marin never accepted the comfort of that explanation. In her mind, her decision to remain in the aircraft had created the chain of events that ended with her brother's death. What made the grief worse was that Callum had left behind a young daughter named Elsie, a little girl who was only 4 years old. Marin watched her sister-in-law struggle to raise her alone, and something inside Marin broke. She no longer wanted medals, promotions, or applause. She wanted to disappear. When the military offered her the opportunity to return to active flight status after her recovery, she refused. She requested reassignment and eventually accepted a position as an aircraft maintenance technician under a different identity classification. It was not officially a secret, but because she had stepped away from the program, almost everyone assumed she had simply been an ordinary pilot who had failed to continue her career. Marin never corrected them. For 8 years, she repaired the machines she once flew. She became the person who stayed behind while others climbed into cockpits. She tightened bolts, inspected landing gear, tested oxygen systems, studied engine vibrations, and quietly watched younger pilots leave the runway. Sometimes she would stand beneath a fighter aircraft after everyone had gone, resting her hand against the metal as if touching an old friend she was afraid to speak to. She never told anyone how much she missed the sky. The only person who seemed to understand was Colonel Everett Shaw, now the base commander. He had been Marin's instructor years earlier, and although he knew exactly who she was, he respected her silence. He never pushed her to return. He simply kept an eye on her from a distance, hoping that one day she might forgive herself. That day arrived when the country faced a crisis no one at Falcon Ridge had expected. It began on a bright afternoon when the sky was almost painfully blue. Several military aircraft were conducting routine patrols over a remote training corridor when radar operators detected a formation of unidentified hostile fighters approaching restricted airspace. At first, the command center assumed the aircraft would turn away after being warned. Instead, they accelerated. Within minutes, alarms spread across Falcon Ridge. Pilots were ordered into the air. The first group launched successfully, but the situation changed quickly. The hostile aircraft were faster and more heavily armed than intelligence reports had predicted. One friendly fighter suffered an engine failure. Another was forced to abandon the engagement after sustaining serious damage. Two more aircraft were diverted to protect a civilian air corridor after an unexpected communications failure caused several commercial flights to enter the danger zone. The base suddenly had too few fighters in the air. Marin was inside a maintenance hangar when she heard the emergency sirens. She froze. The sound was different from ordinary drills. There was urgency in it, a rawness that made every person in the hangar stop moving. Mechanics ran toward their assigned stations while officers shouted instructions. Marin looked toward the runway and saw smoke rising in the distance. Then the command system announced that the remaining combat aircraft were being prepared for immediate launch. Marin's heart began pounding. She tried to ignore the feeling. She had spent 8 years building walls between herself and the sky, and now those walls were trembling. On the far side of the hangar stood a fighter that had been undergoing repairs for weeks. Its primary pilot had been injured during the earlier engagement. The aircraft was operational, but the replacement pilot had not yet arrived. Colonel Shaw entered the hangar with several officers behind him. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. One aircraft had been shot down. Another was running critically low on fuel. The hostile formation had changed direction and was now moving toward a populated corridor. Shaw looked at the aircraft. Then he looked at the flight roster. Then he looked at Marin. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marin understood what he was thinking before he said anything. She shook her head. Shaw did not argue. Instead, he quietly asked the operations officer to bring up the archived flight records of every qualified pilot currently available on the base. The list was painfully short. Marin knew there was only one person left who could fly that aircraft. Herself. She walked toward the fighter. Every step felt like walking toward the life she had buried. A young mechanic named Bennett Cole noticed her moving toward the cockpit and assumed she was preparing the aircraft for someone else. He followed her, carrying a tablet filled with emergency diagnostics. Bennett had worked beside Marin for nearly 3 years and had always considered her the calmest person on the entire base. He had never seen her nervous. Now he saw something different in her eyes. He asked whether she was all right. Marin looked at him for several seconds before finally telling him the truth. She was not a mechanic. She was a pilot. Bennett stared at her in disbelief. Then Colonel Shaw arrived and confirmed everything. The secret that had survived 8 years was suddenly no longer a secret. Marin climbed into the cockpit. Her hands trembled. Not because she had forgotten how to fly, but because she remembered everything. The seat. The instruments. The smell of aviation fuel. The familiar curve of the canopy. And the terrible memory of the last time she had looked at the sky from inside a fighter. Before the canopy closed, Shaw placed a hand against the side of the aircraft. He knew what she was carrying with her. He also knew that telling her she was brave would not be enough. Maren finally understood something she had refused to accept for years. Callum had not died because she was a pilot. He had died because tragedy sometimes arrived without asking permission. Running from the sky had never brought him back. It had only allowed grief to take 8 years of her life. She started the engine. The aircraft roared down the runway beneath the afternoon sun. For the first few seconds, Maren felt nothing except terror. Then the wheels left the ground. The world opened beneath her. The mountains became smaller. The roads became thin lines. The clouds stretched across the horizon. And for the first time in 8 years, Maren remembered who she was. She was not the woman who had survived a crash. She was not the sister who had lost her brother. She was not the mechanic hiding from her past. She was Maren Vale. A pilot. She reached the combat corridor just as the remaining friendly aircraft were being overwhelmed. The hostile fighters had positioned themselves between the military formation and the civilian air route. Maren immediately recognized their strategy. They were forcing the defenders into a choice between engaging them and risking civilian casualties. She refused to make that choice. Instead, she used the terrain. Her years working on aircraft had given her an understanding of performance that many active pilots lacked. She knew precisely how the fighter responded under stress, which systems could be pushed beyond recommended limits, and how much maneuverability remained when the aircraft was carrying a damaged external fuel tank. She flew lower. The hostile aircraft followed. Maren pulled through a narrow mountain corridor, forcing the enemy formation to break apart. One fighter lost sight of her. Another overshot. A third turned toward the civilian route, but Maren intercepted it before it could reach the corridor. Her aircraft took damage. Warning lights flashed. The left engine began losing power. For one terrible moment, she was back inside the aircraft that had crashed 8 years earlier. Her breathing became shallow. The sky blurred. She heard Callum's voice in her memory, reminding her of something he had told her when they were children. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was deciding what mattered more than fear. Maren steadied her breathing. She did not fight the fear. She flew with it. Using the damaged engine and the remaining control surfaces, she maneuvered behind the final hostile fighter. She could have destroyed it, but she noticed something unexpected. The aircraft was already badly damaged and struggling to maintain control. The pilot was trying to escape. Maren could have ended the threat immediately. Instead, she made a different choice. She forced the aircraft away from the civilian corridor and disabled its remaining offensive capability without destroying it. The hostile pilot surrendered. The sky finally became quiet. When Maren returned to Falcon Ridge, her aircraft landed hard but safely. The runway crew surrounded the fighter. Maren climbed out of the cockpit slowly. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Bennett ran toward her. Colonel Shaw followed. Maren looked around at the people who had known her for years without ever knowing the most important part of her story. She expected judgment. Instead, she saw tears. The pilots she had watched from the ground stood before her with respect in their eyes. One of the youngest pilots removed his helmet and lowered his head, overwhelmed by the realization that the quiet mechanic who had repaired his aircraft dozens of times had secretly been the person capable of saving them all. But the most important moment came later that afternoon. Maren traveled to the memorial garden where Callum's name was engraved beside those of others who had died serving their country. Elsie was there with her mother. Elsie was now 12 years old enough to understand what her aunt had sacrificed and old enough to understand why Maren had stayed away from the cockpit for so long. Maren placed a small aviation badge beneath Callum's memorial plaque. She had carried it for 8 years. She had never been able to give it away. Elsie took her aunt's hand. There was no dramatic speech. No perfect explanation. Only the quiet understanding between two people who had both lost someone they loved. Maren finally allowed herself to cry. For 8 years, she had believed that moving forward meant leaving Callum behind. Now she understood that moving forward meant carrying his memory with her without allowing grief to control the rest of her life. In the weeks that followed, Maren's story spread throughout the military. She was offered promotions, awards, and opportunities to return permanently to active flight duty. But she did something nobody expected. She accepted a position training young pilots while continuing her work with maintenance crews. She wanted them to understand that a pilot was not merely someone who could control an aircraft. A pilot had to understand the machine, respect the people who maintained it, recognize fear, and know when saving a life mattered more than winning a battle. She also began visiting families of fallen service members, something she had once avoided because their grief reminded her too much of her own. Now she sat with them, listened to their stories, and helped them understand that grief did not have to erase hope. Maren never hid her identity again. She flew whenever she was needed, but she never forgot the 8 years she had spent on the ground. Those years had taught her something the cockpit never could: sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who stand in the spotlight. Sometimes they are the quiet ones repairing broken things, carrying invisible pain, and showing up every day even when nobody knows what they have survived. Years later, a young trainee asked Maren why she had hidden her identity for so long. She smiled gently and looked toward the runway, where another fighter was preparing to take off beneath a bright afternoon sky. She had once believed that the sky was where she belonged. Now she understood that home was not a place in the sky or on the ground. Home was the courage to finally stop running from yourself. And somewhere inside that understanding, Maren felt that her brother's memory was no longer a wound. It had become a light. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe Maren's story teaches us about courage, grief, forgiveness, and second chances. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is carrying the strength to save everyone else, and sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating an enemy in the sky, but finally defeating the fear inside your own heart. Maren spent 8 years hiding from the woman she had once been, only to discover that she had never truly lost her. She had simply been waiting for the day when she was ready to fly again.